Attorney Tim Williams answers your most frequently asked questions.
So we here at the firm handle many trucking cases, a lot more than, frankly, most firms in the state. And so we've developed somewhat of an expertise in the area. And we get asked all the time when people first come to us and say, hey, I was involved in this horrible collision, it involves a semi-truck, we're getting the runaround from the insurance carrier for the semi-truck. What do you do? Like, what's the game plan? Like, what do we got looking forward in terms of the case, and more specifically in terms of any experts that we need involved in the case to prove the liability side as well as prove my damages side or my injuries. So I'm just going to focus on the expert witnesses portion of that because it's a much larger conversation, from case inception to the end of the case itself. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there. It's fairly complex, but I'm going to focus on one little slice of that, and that is the expert witnesses. So first and foremost, when a trucking case comes to me, I'm looking at three things. I'm looking at liability. So is the trucker at fault, or is he or she not? I'm looking at causation. Did the collision involving that semi-truck cause any injuries to my client? And I'm looking at damages. What exactly are those injuries? What are the damages, economic and non-economic, and what's that worth? So those are the three areas that I'm looking at initially at case inception. So when I'm thinking about liability, I'm thinking, okay, what experts do I need, if any, to prove liability in this case? And more often than not, you do need liability experts in a truck accident case. For example, trucks have a fair amount of data recorders that are just loaded into them. There's steering input recorders, there's speed recorders, it'd be that GPS or based off the speed or the speedometer. There are recorders that record braking input, recorders that record acceleration input, recorders that oftentimes record vectoring or in which direction the truck is turning at the time. So steering input coupled with the G-forces involved to tell how sharp the turn is and at what speed. So usually that data is captured in such a way that even I as a lawyer, I can't access it or kind of understand it. So you have to hire someone that has a special software that's licensed from the software manufacturer that installed the software into the truck itself and can download that data, interpret the data, and spit it out in a way that makes sense to normal people like you and I. So we're looking at folks that can do that. So we're looking at raw data from the truck itself. In addition to that, I'm looking at potentially accident reconstruction. So based on that raw data, based on witness statements that are out there, the police report, how can we show via diagram or via animation, how can we show what exactly happened to cause this particular event? Where was the truck located? Where was it located in the lanes? What did it do wrong? What was the speed of the vehicle involved? What are the vehicle dynamics in terms of the collision itself, so on and so forth. So now we're looking at engineers and accident reconstructionists to do that bit. In addition to that, we have general liability rules that regulate the trucking industry. In fact, it's heavily regulated as a matter of federal law. So we're looking at the rules that are out there and whether or not this particular trucking company and or this particular truck driver had violated any of those rules or whether they followed any of those rules. So we're now looking at those things, and many of those we can read. They're posted online. They're posted in various legal sources that we have access to. But oftentimes it requires bringing an actual truck driver in, someone who has experience behind the wheel, and say, okay, this is the rule, this is what we know. Does it appear that this individual, this truck driver or the company followed the rule, followed what they're required to do? And did that cause this accident or this collision? So it's really incumbent upon us to be able to show also that not just a matter of vehicle dynamics and the data, but also as the day-to-day operations. Was this person negligent? Did they follow the rules? Did they act as a truck driver reasonably would under the circumstances, or did they not act that way? So I talked about liability. So in addition to the liability experts, we also have experts that deal with remember there's three parts. There's liability, there's causation. So what did the bad act cause, or what did the crash cause in terms of injuries? And there's damages. What are those injuries precisely, and what are they worth in terms of economic, out-of-pocket expenses, lost wages, medical expenses, things of that nature. And then non-economic damages, that's the pain and suffering, as most people would phrase it. So focusing then on the last two sections, which are usually globbed together with these experts, and that's the causation and damages sections or issues. We oftentimes will use a person's primary care provider. And that's really the best before and after expert witness that you can use, because that doctor is seeing the patient leading up to the date of the collision and knows what their conditions were, their physical conditions and whatnot, and then also saw the patient after the collision and can testify as to the night and day difference between before versus after. So that's usually a very key doctor to have. In addition to that, we like to get the experts involved to the extent specialists involved to the extent there's specialists involved. That would include things like a neurologist, a neurosurgeon. Neurosurgeon is literally a brain surgeon. An orthopedic surgeon, those are the bone and joint doctors that are surgeons. Sometimes a psychologist if there's psychological damage, such as PTSD, anxiety, depression disorder stemming from either the injuries themselves or the event itself. Dental experts, to the extent there's tooth injury and need for surgery, and so on and so forth in the mouth itself. Sometimes neuropsychologists, those are people that test someone with a brain injury to determine, okay, where is the brain not functioning and what areas is the brain not functioning? Is it memory? Is it cognition? Is it simply fatigue? Or is it something else? So that's just an example, and there's many more, but that's an example of the experts that we would use in a trucking case on the medical issues. Part and parcel to that, extending beyond that, are the experts we use on the other types of damages, such as a vocational expert. And that's an expert that would come in and say, okay, based on this person's training, their education, and their work experience, as well as their physical condition at the time before the crash, this is the universe of jobs they were qualified to work. They could be a plumber, they could be an electrician, they could work at a front office, they could do reception, they could be a mail carrier. And so that's a whole series of jobs that they're able to do. Now, if you think about it, when someone's involved in a crash with permanent injuries, if those permanent injuries affect their work ability, that's what we call an impaired earning capacity claim. So their ability to earn a living has been impaired. The universe of jobs they were qualified to do and could physically do has now shrunk because of the physical limitations. So the vocational expert comes in and describe between the universe of jobs they were otherwise able to do, had they wanted to do so, and the universe of jobs they're left with after their physical injuries. That difference is what they're focused on. What jobs could they once do they could no longer do? So that person will come in and testify on that issue. And then following that person would be an economist. And so the economist's job is to put numbers to that testimony, to say, aha, well, if they can only work 20% of the jobs they were once able to work in this particular community, in this particular job market, that equates to X amount per year of impairment of their earning capacity. So then that person would then put numbers to the vocational expert's opinions and testimony. So finally, in addition to that, we could have, for example, contractors. Okay, so like I'm talking building contractors come in and testify, and you say, well, why would you have a building contractor come in and testify on a personal injury case? It's this: oftentimes truck accidents cause severe debilitating injuries. Oftentimes those injuries require extensive, if not permanent, wheelchair use, for example, crutch use, walker use, physical ailments. So you then bring a building contractor in to determine, one, the scope of work to adjust that person's home to accommodate their newfound and unfortunate physical limitations, and then two, give a bid in terms of what it's going to cost to modify their home to adjust to their new living situation and their new physical limitations. So that's just an example of maybe an expert most people wouldn't even think of would be involved in a trucking case. And then finally, if it's a permanent long-standing injury, what we would generally do is get what's called a life care planner involved, and that's sort of quasi-medical expert, but that person coordinates between all the doctors and all their prognosis and their future care plans and pulls data to determine what that person's life care is going to be, life care plan is going to be in terms of their usually their medical treatment. And then they put numbers to those figures. So if they're going to need 10 years of periodic physical therapy, they're going to need 20 years of periodic visits to their psychologist. They're going to need 20 years of periodic visits to their neurosurgeon. They're likely to have a fusion of their C6, C7 spine in the future because of some degeneration, but more importantly, post-traumatic arthritis that's ongoing because of the fractures that the accident caused, for example. They're putting numbers to all these things and it's literally setting out a life care plan moving into the future so that the jury can consider that as an element of damages. And that's a general overview of the types of experts that are involved. Every case doesn't have every one of those experts involved. I tried a trucking case a bit ago, and gosh, we had a neurosurgeon testify, we had a vocational expert testify, we had a psychologist testify in that case. And liability was ultimately admitted about a week outside of trial, so we didn't need our liability experts to come in and testify. And that case ended up, just those 3 experts, is about $70,000 in expert witness fees just for us to get that testimony developed and onto into the courthouse and in front of the jury. But the case came back at almost $4.5 million in terms of the verdict itself. So, it's very expensive, it's very time-consuming, very oftentimes confusing to get the right experts involved in the right spots to make sure all your bases are covered. But it almost inevitably will pan out in the end of the case, because you need those folks for the jury to make a right decision on your behalf and not be guessing, because the court will tell them at the beginning, you cannot base your decision on guesswork or conjecture. You can't guess, you can't speculate, you can't just pull numbers out of thin blue air. You have to base it on solid evidence you find to be credible. And the only way to get that evidence in oftentimes is through our expert witnesses. So it's oftentimes a multifaceted, confusing situation, but thankfully we've had a ton of experience, and we'd like to think we have the expertise to move forward these cases in a expeditious but complete fashion to ultimately get the folks the reimbursement that they deserve.
If you've been injured and need help, Dwyer Williams Cherkoss Attorneys will get you the settlement you deserve. Experience gets results.